Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. And joining us today on this COVID-19 podcast series that we are naming the DEFAERO Report Daily is Byron Callan of the independent Washington research firm Capital Alpha Partners, who normally joins us on our Thursday for Friday podcast. He was supposed to join us yesterday, but we had a technical issue. Otherwise, you would have heard his expert analysis of the economic package President Trump announced today before the president had announced it. Byron, thanks for joining us again.
Glad to be back, Vago.
So markets have rebounded today, up about 5% on the announcement of nearly $1 trillion package, an $850 billion in the morning. But by the afternoon, that number was already up to $1.2 trillion, according to a Bloomberg report, which is, let's use the word, either bailout or economic support for airlines, aircraft makers like Boeing, direct checks to Americans of $1,000. Obviously, Boeing's still struggling in the wake of the year-long grounding of its 737 MAX. Talk to us about this entire package. What does it mean? And taken in totality with all the other measures the Fed has done, right? I mean, it was the package by the Fed, terrified investors, which is why we had that really, really bad market day yesterday. Talk to us about where we are and where we're going.
Following this is like watching a ping pong ball, right? It's going to bounce around. And, you know, we were down yesterday, we're up today. I mean, we could be down tomorrow. I don't want to get too fixated on the day-to-day gyrations in the stock market. But clearly, you know, I think there's been a bit more galvanization in Washington, D.C. to really do something about it. Now, I was reading something today and I thought, you know, I kind of recall this from 2008, which was an observation, you know, whatever you think your number is to solve this problem, double it. And I think, you know, we don't know, obviously, how long this is going to be impacting the U.S. economy, the global economy. You know, when I see things like New York City may be going on shutdown in the next couple of days, you know, that's another peg in the board that says this is going to be really very traumatic economically for potentially a short period of time. But again, we don't know that. So yes, this aid could help. It looks like it will be somewhat means tested. You know, if you're a millionaire, you're not going to get a check for $1,000. But you also have to ask yourself, is that going to be enough? If I look at prevailing rents, costs of living in a lot of major cities, I mean, it's okay, but it's not. It may be like the Bush administration check that went out in 2008. I mean, it was kind of nice to have, but did it provide anybody the wherewithal to live on for a month or two? And that, I suppose, is a conceivable scenario, depending on how long this thing lasts. So,
well, so that's the key question, right? The last thing was a mortgage crisis, whereas this is actually a demand crisis. People aren't able to go to work. It's great to put some liquidity into the market, but at the end of the day, it's a different sort of economic crisis.
Well, absolutely. And the United States has a services economy. And, you know, you can look at the broad metric on savings rates, but, you know, I wrote a note today. If you look at I think it's Bankrate does this survey kind of every couple of months about how much Americans actually save. And I think it was something like only 41% of Americans could meet $1,000 in unexpected savings by just drawing down their own savings account. Now that's $1,000. That's not, you know, $1,800 in rent plus your medical bill plus your student loan debt plus your food for a month. So I'm just trying to suggest that, you know, this might seem like a lot of money, but if you think about it in the context of something that lasts for a month or 2 months, it may just be the start of something. And so I still think right now, probably the most useful thing, Vago, is to just kind of get people oriented towards, so what are the longer term ramifications, the second and third order effects that, you know, if you're in this industry, if you're a defense planner and you're starting to think about your strategic plan for the next year, or, you're a staffer on the Hill, or you're in the service and you're worried about the industrial base issues, what should you be thinking about, and how this is going to look over the next couple of months, and years, really. And I think that's kind of where I want to try and orient people with some of this stuff.
Everything has focused on impact on airlines, obviously very, very severe, because passenger air traffic is virtually halted, or at least demand has dropped precipitously. And then we've got national flight restrictions, as you mentioned. In roughly 48 hours, Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York, is expected to, ask people to shelter in place. It's good to give people warning to stock up on water, food, and what have you. But folks are looking at what the impact on Boeing is. But what is the aggregate impact on the entire defense ecosystem, as contractor after contractor is trying to calculate what the impact on them is going to be at the end of the day, that goes beyond sort of slipped program decisions, or meetings that aren't happening? Although I think that people are trying to compensate, obviously, through virtual and other means. What's that broader impact that we should be keeping our eye on?
Well, look, the defense industry is not self quarantining. I mean, it's part of the economy, and it may not be as directly impacted by the demand destruction that you're seeing in air travel, or kind of the leisure hospitality industry, or the food service industry. But come on, they rely on civilian airlines for to move their employees around. Some of their supply chain is going to be hinged to that. The ground transportation services, they move things around in the trucking system. I think the most interesting issue that I would worry about in defense right now is really, it's the less visible, smaller private companies that may do both work for commercial aerospace and defense. And let's say you do 70% of your work with commercial aerospace, 30% of it for defense. Well, if 70% of your business is suddenly put on ice for a couple of months, you're going to have financial problems. And those are the companies that's kind of at that level of the industrial base that I think people ought to be thinking about, where there could really be a problem here.
Do you think that the commercial paper decision on the part of the Fed to buy up some commercial paper is something that is potentially meaningful in this industry? Or will the increased liquidity be something that's going to be a needle mover?
It just takes time for that liquidity mover to, kind of work its way through the system. And I think kind of the recognition, maybe the direct payment shift that you've seen literally over the last 48 hours or something, that's really kind of how you address these very, very immediate concerns. How are people going to pay rent? How are people going to pay loans? How are people going to pay for food? If they're shut in, or their businesses aren't working. The liquidity, that's going to be provided by some of the Fed stuff, that's going to take time. I mean, a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months even, to kind of make it through the entire system. And so there may be a period where you probably need to do more work on this, or I need to do more work on this, but it's really kind of looking at, like, so what happened to the automobile industry in 2008, 2009? They were clearly slammed badly in the non-financial crisis, but I think in May of 2009, there was actually a federal aid program put in place for smaller automotive suppliers. So, I think you're going to start seeing the same kind of stuff emerge, really based on a recognition that the defense industrial base is tied to these other sectors. And, if you don't do something, you're going to have problems that are going to ricochet back in defense.
As this crisis was getting bad, there was this sense that, Joe Biden is likely going to get elected, and this is going to really impact President Trump's reelection prospects. But if you start to put $1,000 checks into people's pockets, and now you have Republicans that are backing that, right? I mean, the last time we had a massive financial collapse, it was Republicans saying that people shouldn't be getting handouts, that the aid packages should be very small, which is why we did two $750 billion roughly, bailout packages, and that's not what should happen. This time it looks like Republicans are aboard, and certainly Democrats look like they're going to be aboard. So does this change the political calculus at all, in your estimation?
I mean, it's a valid point, Vago, but I think it's just too soon to tell. I mean, I think if you play that scenario out where somehow the administration, looks like they've recovered and they've got this thing under control, and the one-time payments, kind of keep people solvent. I think we're going to know that in the next probably 15 to 45 days. If it turns out that we're still struggling, we still don't have a national policy on kind of standards. You still see these very criminally lackadaisical airport security for people coming from Europe. I mean, I see a lot of stories about people like literally just walking through, having arrived on flights from outside the United States without getting any kind of check or scan or anything like that. So I'm not sure, if a month from now you're looking at something where, we're still on an upward glide path. People you're really in a financial stress zone at that point. Then I think you might see a lot more of the finger pointing and like, how did we arrive at this place? Because quite well, the whole notion of a pandemic, sure, completely unpredictable. No one knows the timing of when something like this would happen, but it's been part of an array of security threats that no one could say that something like this was impossible.
That's absolutely true. And we're at the early stages of this, and people still can't get tests, right? I mean, so at the end of the day, there are a lot of people who suspect that they themselves may have been exposed. And what they do is they call their doctor's office. The doctor tells you to go to the emergency room or to the CDC, or are told, hey, look, wait till it gets better because you could be asymptomatic, right? I mean, so nobody really knows enough. So this could be a lot worse, which we understand is one of the reasons why the president and his allies so abruptly did an about face in terms of this being a hoax and everything, to being like, okay, this is something that is very, very serious. Very briefly before we wrap, what are things that folks should be watching for, right? What are the things you're watching for as you watch this crisis unfold, both as somebody who's watched markets for 4 decades, but also the political scene and the industrial scene?
Well, I mean, just the fundamental, the daily data on what are coronavirus, what's the infection rate, what's the death rate, the CFR, the data that's going to come out of this. I saw something today where this person was commenting that let's really see what comes out of South Korea. They're kind of coming up to a point where there really should be good data out of South Korea on what coronavirus really did. I'd like to see, I think in the coming days, there are parts of the country that are behaving as if this is a war. San Francisco, possibly New York City, I mean, Ohio, some of the things that state governors are doing, but there are other places, and maybe this is kind of my personal experience from 9/11. I worked in New York City across the street from the World Trade Centers on 9/11. And, if you were in Lower Manhattan for a couple of months after 9/11, it was a war zone. If I went to Dallas or Los Angeles or Kansas City, life was completely normal. So I just wonder too, if you get more, if this becomes more of a nationwide problem and a nationwide response, that'd be something to me that might also be worth watching. And then from the defense side, we're starting to come up to an earnings season in April. I think companies should be commenting on this, hopefully before the actual earnings reports, maybe doing some pre-announcements if they've got any issues. I drove by the Lockheed Martin Sikorsky plant in Connecticut yesterday, and a little, not exactly field research, but the parking lot was full. That was good to see. But you could see, you'd want to watch for some of these local plant closings that may happen as a result of the diktats that some of the governors in these different states are now laying down.
Byron, thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Look forward to having you back on for the big podcast on Thursday. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and stay healthy.
You too. Thanks for joining us today, and join us tomorrow for our next segment. Follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn, and check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.